In 465 BCE, a woman was dragged into the courtyard of the most magnificent palace on earth. What followed was so brutal that even the hardened soldiers who witnessed it couldn't speak of it without trembling. Her crime? Saying no to the wrong man. But here's the truly horrifying part. This wasn't an isolated incident. It wasn't a random act of cruelty. This was just one day in the Persian royal court, one crime in a decades-long pattern that turned the world's most beautiful palace into a chamber of psychological torture. The man responsible. You've heard of him. You know his armies, you've seen him in movies, but you don't truly understand what he was. History wants you to remember King Xerxes I of Persia as a warrior, a man who led millions against Greece. The builder of monuments that defied imagination. That's the story we tell because it's easier to digest. But what if I told you that behind those golden walls, a different war was being fought? A war without swords or shields, where victims couldn't run, couldn't fight back, couldn't even speak their truth without risking everything they loved. This story was buried for over 2,000 years, not because it was insignificant, but because it shows a side of power and authority that we don't like to talk about. The greatest atrocity of Xerxes' reign had nothing to do with Greece. It had everything to do with the women in his palace. To understand the horror of what happened, we have to look at the man at the center of it all, Xerxes, who took the throne in October 486 BC. With the death of his father, Darius the Great, Xerxes ascended to lead the largest empire the world had ever seen. But from that moment on, he would never experience a single genuine human interaction. Think about that for a second. Every person who approached him had to perform proskynesis, falling face down on the ground, kissing the earth before him, prostrating themselves as if before a deity. No one could turn their back to him. To do so was death. No one could look directly into his eyes unless given explicit permission. No one could speak unless spoken to first. This was not mere ritual. This was psychological warfare, a system designed to isolate him from humanity. And it worked. Xerxes' conditioning came from a very young age. His mother Atose, a woman who understood power like no one else, taught him a brutal lesson: trust nothing. Control everything. Show no weakness. In the royal courts, Xerxes' power became absolute, but his humanity was stripped away. He was conditioned to believe that everyone around him existed only to serve his will. This, of course, was reflected in the Persian royal household being underrun. Unlike what we see in Hollywood depictions, it wasn't a wild, indulgent space. It was a political institution. And Xerxes, contrary to common belief, was married to only one woman, Queen Xerxes. Xerxes was just a queen. She was a woman of immense power in her own right. But all that power existed at Xerxes' pleasure. He could strip it away with a word. The women in the royal household lived in unimaginable luxury, but they were prisoners. The Greek physician Zeus described the women's quarters as sealed off by walls, with locked gates. Male visitors were forbidden, except for the king and a few eunuchs. The women could look out from their high windows at the world below, but they couldn't partake in. They were isolated, their powerlessness disguised as privilege, their oppression was greeted as honor. But then something went horribly wrong. Xerxes became obsessed with the wife of his own brother, Ists. She was a woman of immense power, married to one of his most trusted commanders. She lived a relatively normal life within the constraints of the royal court, and Xerxes wanted her. The truly chilling part, she said no. She said no to the most powerful man on earth, a king who had absolute power over life and death, who could have taken whatever he wanted, and she refused him. For most men this would have been the end of it, but not for Xerxes. His conditioning told him that his desires were divine mandates. The very idea that anyone could say no to him was a direct challenge to the order of the universe itself. So he didn't stop. He turned his attention to the woman's daughter, Artante, Xerxes' niece. She was young, impressionable, and, unlike her mother, she didn't refuse him. Xerxes took her as his mistress, but it wasn't just about the affair. This was about power, about proving that he could control even the unyielding. Artante, caught in this web of manipulation, asked for a specific gift, a robe woven by Xerxes' wife, Queen Xerxes. It was a robe that symbolized Xerxes' status, a unique garment crafted with gold thread and royal purple. Xerxes gave it to her, knowing exactly what he was doing, knowing it would humiliate his queen. When Xerxes saw her robe on her daughter, She understood immediately what had happened, and she had a plan. The king's birthday celebration presented the perfect opportunity for Xerxes to strike. Persian custom dictated that the king must grant any request made of him on this day, and in front of all the most powerful nobles. Xerxes made her request. She wanted the wife of Mos Ist delivered to her as a gift. Xerxes had no choice but to comply. What followed was an act so brutal that even Herodotus, the Greek historian, struggled to describe it. Xerxes had the woman mutilated, her breasts were cut off, her nose, ears, lips, and tongue removed. And then, she was sent back to her husband in this condition, as a message, by horrific statement of power. Xerxes' response? He begged his wife to choose something else. He offered her wealth, cities, armies, anything but this. But Xerxes had made her request, and it could not be refused. Mos Ist responded as you'd expect, with rage. He attempted to rebel, but the revolt was swiftly crushed. His family, everyone, was executed. All because one man believed his desires were divine imperatives. And here's the chilling question that no one asked: was this an isolated incident? Or was it a glimpse into a much darker system? Xerxes' empire was designed to be absolute, unyielding. The records only tell us of military victories, not of the personal horrors that took place behind the palace walls. By the end of his reign, Xerxes was a prisoner of his own creation. His paranoia grew. His isolation deepened. His own bodyguard, Artabanus, eventually conspired against him, leading to his assassination. The very system Xerxes built to control everyone around him ultimately destroyed him. The women of Xerxes' court, his queens, daughters, and concubines, never saw this as tragedy. They were taught to see it as honor, as a privilege. And that is the most insidious form of oppression, when the victims defend their own subjugation, when they cannot even see their own chains. The ruins of Persepolis stand today as silent witnesses to this history. The columns reach toward the sky like broken fingers, standing in mute testimony to the women whose names were erased, the voices that were silenced, and the lies that were lived under the shadow of one man's absolute power. The palace may have crumbled, the empire may have fallen, but the lesson remains: absolute power doesn't just corrupt, it dehumanizes, isolates, and destroys, leaving nothing but echoes of what was once a civilization. The empire may be gone, and the palace may be in ruins, but the story of Xerxes and his court offers us a chilling warning that echoes through the centuries. It shows us what happens when power goes unchecked, when absolute authority is not just wielded, but internalized. The story of Xerxes is not just a tale of a king's cruelty, it is the story of a system that dehumanizes everyone within it, turning even the most powerful into prisoners of their own making. Xerxes was not a lone tyrant. He was the product of a system that demanded obedience, that crushed empathy, and that turned the most intimate relationships into power struggles. It wasn't just the queens, the concubines, or the women of his court who suffered. It was everyone who lived within that system, who had to conform to a world where power was divine, and submission was the only path to survival. In the end, Xerxes' reign was a cautionary tale about the dangers of absolute power. His paranoia, his isolation, and his brutal treatment of those closest to him led to his downfall. But it was more than just the death of a king. It was the collapse of an empire built on fear and control, one that failed to see the humanity of the people it subjugated. And yet, the question remains: how many other rulers, in history and today, follow this same pattern? How many leaders, surrounded by walls of power, by sycophants, and by institutions designed to reinforce their divinity, end up trapped by the very systems they create? How many individuals, raised within oppressive systems, continue to defend their own subjugation, unable to see the chains that bind them? The story of Xerxes' court is not just ancient history. It is a reflection of the psychological toll that systems of absolute power take on the human soul. It reminds us of the importance of accountability, of empathy, and of the dangers of dehumanizing those around us. It shows us that power, when unchecked, does not just corrupt, it destroys, isolating those who hold it and those who are affected by it. As you walk through the ruins of Persepolis today, the columns may seem to speak of glory, but they also speak of something darker. They speak of a time when the walls of the palace became the tomb of human connection, and the cost of absolute power was paid by everyone who lived under its shadow. The lessons of Xerxes' reign of isolation, control, and dehumanization are not confined to the past. They are a warning that resonates through time, urging us to question the systems of power we live within and to never forget the cost of unchecked authority. Remember Xerxes, remember his court, and remember that behind every empire's grandeur, there are the forgotten lives of those who were crushed beneath it. The ruins of Persepolis stand as silent witnesses to the legacy of Xerxes' reign, to the palace that was once the center of a mighty empire. Yet, despite the grandeur of its architecture, what remains beneath the surface is a story of human suffering and systemic oppression. For every column that reaches skyward, there's a story of a life lost to the invisible walls of absolute power. And perhaps, most haunting of all, the cycle continues in places around the world, where power remains unchecked and where those in positions of authority continue to build walls figurative or literal around themselves, surrounding themselves with systems that protect their interests while silencing the voices of the oppressed. The will of Xerxes' court, those whose names we will never know, are not just victims of the past. They are a reminder of the ongoing battle against systems that deny people their humanity. Their story, the story of isolation, control, and psychological destruction, lives on in the struggles of countless people today, whether in the silence of the workplace, the fear in political movements, or the isolation felt by those who are silenced. Their experiences continue to resonate. And yet, there's a deeper lesson here, one that transcends time. The true cost of absolute power is not just what it does to those it seeks to control, but what it does to the ones who wield it. The rulers of ancient Persia and the rulers of today are trapped in their own systems. Their power becomes a cage, their authority a prison. They lose touch with humanity, not just in others but in themselves. And that loss is perhaps the most tragic of all. In the end, the palace of Xerxes fell, the empire crumbled, and his legacy was tarnished by his own tyranny. But the real question is whether we will learn from the past or repeat it. Will we continue to build systems of power that isolate, dehumanize, and destroy? Or will we break down the walls that separate us from each other, build bridges instead of fortresses, and restore the humanity that absolute power seeks to erase? As you reflect on the story, remember that it's not just history. It's a warning, a call to be vigilant, to question authority, and to always remember the cost of power, both the power we hold and the power we give to others. Because in the end, it is not the empires that last, but the people. And it is up to us to ensure that the stories we tell in the future aren't just the stories of the powerful, but the stories of those who fought against the systems that sought to crush them. So as we remember Xerxes and his court, let's not only remember the grandeur of his empire, but the lessons of tyranny and oppression that it represents. Let's learn from the mistakes of the past, not repeat them, and ensure that the world we create is one where power doesn't corrupt, but serves the people. The ruins of Xerxes' palace may stand in silence, but the voices of those who suffered beneath his reign should never be forgotten. And with each passing day, let's strive to make sure that their pain wasn't in vain. As the wind blows through the remnants of Persepolis, it whispers a story that time can't erase. Xerxes and his empire are long gone, but the lessons of his reign of absolute power, unchecked cruelty, and the erasure of humanity in the pursuit of control still reverberate across the centuries. The walls that once held court to his grandeur have crumbled, yet the sculptures of power they represent persist even today. We live in a world still haunted by the shadows of Xerxes' empire, systems of control that thrive in silence, unseen by those who benefit from them, and invisible to those who are trapped within. The palace that once housed the most powerful man in the world now lies in ruins. Yet in every corner of our world, power still isolates, still crushes. The people who suffer within these systems, those who are denied their humanity, their dignity, their freedom, are not just victims of the past. They are our present-day reality too. And just as Xerxes' empire collapsed under the weight of its own oppression, we must ask, what will it take for us to recognize the walls we built around ourselves? What will it take for us to understand that power that isolates, that dehumanizes, will eventually crumble, just as the empire itself did? This is the true legacy of Xerxes' reign, not just the rise and fall of an empire, but the profound reminder that absolute power, unchecked, will always erode the very essence of humanity, both in those who suffer from it and those who wield it. The history we must reckon with is not just the one written in the books of conquerors and kings, It's the history of those who never had the chance to write their own story. So the question remains, what will we do with this knowledge? Will we allow these lessons to fade with the dust of ancient ruins? Or will we carry them forward to change the systems of power that still exist around us? The walls of the palace may have crumbled, but the work is not finished. It's up to us in this moment to ensure that the stories of those who were silenced are heard, to make sure that we're not repeating the mistakes of the past, but learning from them. The ruins of Xerxes' palace are silent, but the voices of those who suffered there should never be forgotten. And in the face of the systems that continue to dehumanize, it's our responsibility to make sure that the empire's legacy of cruelty doesn't live on. The legacy of Xerxes' empire is one of stark contrasts. On one hand, grand monuments to human ambition, and on the other, the silent, often unseen suffering of those caught in the gears of absolute power. Xerxes, once a god-minded king surrounded by wealth and control, left behind a story of tragedy and manipulation, of a court designed to break the very essence of humanity in the name of divine supremacy. But as we look back at the ruins of Persepolis, we must remember that the story of Xerxes is not just about one man, one empire, or one court. It is the story of power itself, and how it corrupts, isolates, and destroys, It is the story of the systems we build to maintain control, systems that, like the crumbled columns of Persepolis, may seem invincible at first, but inevitably crack under the weight of their own cruelty. And this is where we must ask ourselves, what will we do in the face of these systems today? Will we allow the same patterns of dehumanization to continue unchecked, or will we challenge them? History is not just a record of past mistakes, it is a mirror to our present. The structures that enabled Xerxes' reign of terror are not so different from the systems of power we face now. The silencing of voices, the stripping of autonomy, the elevation of certain people at the cost of others, it is all still happening. So as we stand in the ruins of the past, let us ask ourselves what we will do with the lessons we've learned. Will we stand idly by as others suffer? Or will we work to dismantle the systems of oppression that still thrive, hidden in plain sight? The power to change the course of history is not in the hands of kings or emperors. It's in the hands of those who dare to speak out, who dare to recognize the injustice around them, and who are willing to fight for a future where humanity is honored, not enslaved. Let the story of Xerxes, of the women silenced in his court, and of the people whose lives were destroyed by his empire, be a call to action. A reminder that no matter how strong the walls of oppression may seem, they can always be torn down. If we are willing to confront them, if we are willing to act, and if we are willing to make sure that the voices of those who have suffered, those who were erased from history, are never silenced again. This is not just ancient history. It's the challenge of our present, and it's up to us to ensure that the walls built on the suffering of others do not rise again. The choice is ours. As we close the chapter on the story of Xerxes and his empire, we must reflect on the broader lessons it holds for us. What does it mean to build a system that values power above humanity? To create an environment where individuals, regardless of their station, are dehumanized and reduced to mere tools for the ambition of the powerful. Xerxes' empire thrived on the belief that some people were born to rule and others to serve. But that belief, like the empire itself, was built on a foundation that could not last. Empires rise and fall, but the lessons they leave behind are eternal. We have to ask ourselves how much of Xerxes' world still exists today. How many systems of control, of oppression, of inequality are still in place in our world? Are we still, in some ways, living in the shadows of ancient rulers who sought to control every aspect of life, to strip away the humanity of those they ruled over? The truth is, those systems of power may have evolved, but their core principles remain unchanged. Whether in the walls of the palace or behind the closed doors of modern institutions, the manipulation of power and the silencing of voices are still very much alive. But there's hope. The story of Xerxes is not one of inevitable defeat. It's a reminder of the resilience of the human spirit, of the strength that lies in those who refuse to be silenced, who refuse to bow to unjust systems, and who fight for justice even in the face of overwhelming odds. The women in Xerxes' escort, the men who fought against his empire, the ones who resisted, they left behind a legacy of resistance, a reminder that even in the darkest times, there are those who will stand up and fight for what is right. So as we move forward, let's carry that lesson with us. The walls of oppression may seem insurmountable, but they are not invincible. History is not just a record of what happened, it's a tool for understanding where we are and where we need to go. The story of Xerxes and his empire is one of cruelty. Yes, but it's also a story of the fight for human dignity, of those who dared to resist, and of the power that lies in the refusal to be dehumanized. The question now is not whether Xerxes' legacy will live on, it's whether we will learn from it. Will we allow the same patterns to repeat, or will we be the ones who bring about change? The choice is ours. The lesson is clear, and the fight is far from over. Remember the past, not to glorify it, but to ensure that we do not repeat it. Share this story, share the lessons it teaches us, and let's use this knowledge to build a world where power does not come at the expense of humanity. Because history, when understood, is not just a record of what was, it's a guide for what we can become. The choice is in our hands. As we reflect on the story of Xerxes and the twisted dynamics of his court, we must remember that true power lies not in control, but in the humanity we maintain within systems of power. The ultimate lesson here is the cost of unchecked authority, the erosion of empathy, of relationships, and of the very essence of what it means to be human. Xerxes, in his obsessive drive to assert dominance, lost sight of the true value of those around him, reducing them to mere pawns in his psychological game. He built walls around his palace, around his life, and around his very soul. But in the end, it was not just the walls that trapped him, it was his inability to connect, to see others as equals, to understand that true strength is born from relationships built on trust, respect, and mutual dignity. The destruction of Xerxes' empire, the downfall of his dynasty, and the ultimate betrayal within his family, all point to one fundamental truth: when power becomes absolute, it corrodes everything it touches, from the individual to the system. Xerxes' demise, at the hands of those closest to him, underscores the danger of creating systems where vulnerability is seen as a threatened, where loyalty is born of fear rather than genuine connection. But it's not just about ancient kings and their empires. It's about us, about how we navigate power, how we treat those who are marginalized, and how we resist systems that diminish our humanity. Every society has the potential for both cruelty and compassion, for both domination and empathy. The challenge we face today is in choosing the path of empathy, of recognizing that power, when exercised responsibly, can uplift rather than break. As we move forward, it's up to ensure that the history of Xerxes, the history of unchecked power and psychological manipulation, is not just a tale from the past, but a warning for the future. We must question systems that seek to divide, isolate, and control. We must fight for a world where dignity, freedom, and equality are not privileges, but rights for all. So let this story, this chapter from the past, remind us the pursuit of power without compassion is hollow and destructive. True strength comes from the bonds we form, the humanity we uphold, and the empathy we choose to practice. In a world where we face challenges that may seem insurmountable, remember that it is our shared humanity, our ability to see each other as equals, that is the most powerful force we have. As we close this chapter, remember the lessons learned. Share them, learn from them, and let them guide us as we build a future where power is never the enemy of humanity. Let's not forget what history has shown us. Because in the end, it's not about the empires we build. It's about the people we uplift, the world we create, the choices we make. As we close this story of Xerxes and the devastating consequences of unchecked power, we are left with the reality that power, when placed in the hands of those who cannot see beyond themselves, does not elevate, it crushes. The tragic fate of the women in Xerxes' household, and of the king himself, is a stark reminder of the dangers of systems built on fear, control, and isolation. We've seen how Xerxes' need for domination led to the destruction of everything he held dear: his relationships, his family, his humanity. In the end, he was left with nothing but the ruins of his own empire, a casualty of the very systems he had created to preserve his power. But this isn't just the story of one king's downfall. It's a story that echoes throughout history, one that continues to resonate in our world today. The palace that once stood as a symbol of Persian greatness now lies in ruins, a physical reminder of what happens when power is abused, when systems of control strip away the dignity and worth of those subjected to them. And though Xerxes' empire is long gone, the lesson remains: absolute power, without accountability, breeds corruption, destruction, and ultimately collapse. But there is hope. Just as Xerxes' empire crumbled under the weight of its own dysfunction, So too can we dismantle the oppressive systems that continue to plague our world. We have the power to recognize the dangers of unchecked authority, to stand against systems that dehumanize and divide, and to create a world where empathy, dignity, and equality are not just ideals, but lived realities for all. Let Xerxes' story be a reminder of what happens when we place power above everything else. And let it inspire us to build a future where humanity is never sacrificed at the altar of control. It's time to shift the narrative to rewrite history not as a tale of domination, but as one of liberation, compassion, and shared strength. The lessons of the past are here for us to learn from. Let's use them to create a world where power is used to uplift, not to destroy. Remember, it's not the walls we build that define us. It's the connections we forge, the empathy we show, and the humanity we fight to preserve that truly shape the future. So, as you reflect on the story, ask yourself, what kind of world do we want to create? One of power and control, or one of shared humanity, where no one is ever reduced to an object of another's will? The choice is ours. Let's choose wisely. And so, as we close this chapter, let us carry with us the weight of these lessons. Xerxes' empire may be a relic of the past, but the systems of control he created still echo through time. They show up in the ways we treat the powerless, in the ways we build and maintain power structures, and in the ways we allow those systems to dehumanize others in the name of control, conquest, and fear. Every empire, every nation, every institution has its own palace walls, its own forms of oppression, its own methods of isolating and controlling those it seeks to dominate. And while Xerxes' reign may seem distant, it's not difficult to recognize the parallels in our own time, systems that prioritize the desires of the few over the well-being of the many, that value power over human dignity. But here's where the real change begins. It starts with us. With the stories we choose to tell, the voices we amplify, and the systems we choose to build, we have the power to rewrite history not just in the books we read, but in the world we create. By dismantling systems that divide and oppress, by rejecting the idea that some are born to rule while others are born to serve, we can create something more just and humane. It's easy to look at Xerxes and his empire as a cautionary tale, an ancient civilization that failed under its own weight. But it's harder, yet more important, to look at the structures of power today and ask, how can we do better? How can we prevent the same mistakes from being made in the systems we inherit? This story isn't just a relic. It's a reflection of human nature, our capacity for both destruction and redemption. And it's up to us to decide which path we will walk. Will we follow the example of Xerxes, creating systems that isolate, control, and crush? Or will we work toward systems that value people, that uplift, and that promote justice and equality? As you reflect on this tale of kings and queens, of power and collapse, ask yourself, what kind of legacy do you want to leave? What kind of world do you want to help shape? It's in the small actions, the everyday decisions, the way we treat others and challenge systems of power, that we can begin to shift the narrative. Because history may remember the kings and the conquerors, but it's the people, the ones who stood up for justice, who fought for empathy, who worked to tear down oppressive walls, that truly changed the world. So let's make sure we are part of that change. Subscribe if you want to explore more stories from the past that still resonate today. Share this with someone who needs to hear this message. And comment below with your thoughts, because together we can make history that's worth remembering. In the end, the story of Xerxes is more than just a tale of an ancient king and his empire. It's a mirror to our own world, a reflection of the dynamics of power, control, and resistance that shape every society throughout history. It shows us the fragility of humanity when those in power become disconnected from the very people they rule, when systems of oppression dehumanize and isolate, and when the tools of governance are used not for the good of all, but to maintain dominance. And yet, in the shadows of those empires, in the lives of those who suffer under these systems, there are stories of defiance, of people who refuse to accept their place, who find ways to navigate and ultimately subvert these structures. Like the women in Xerxes' court, those who stand up, speak out, and fight against their own errors. These are the true heroes of history, even if their names are lost to time. This story reminds us that the fight for justice, for dignity, for human rights is never truly over. It is passed from generation to generation, and each of us plays a part in shaping the future. We may not be kings or queens, but we all have the power to challenge systems, to demand better, and to lift up the voices of those who are often silenced. So as we walk away from this story, let's carry its lessons with us. Let's remember that our actions, our choices, and our courage matter. Every time we challenge an unjust system, every time we stand up for those who have no voice, we are writing our own history. The kind of history that future generations will look back on and see as the turning point, the moment when we chose empathy over power, justice over cruelty, and unity over division. Because in the end, true power is not in ruling over others. It's in lifting others up and creating systems where all people are valued, and in building a future where no one is ever again forced to kneel before another in fear. And that is a legacy worth leaving behind. Subscribe if you want to continue exploring hidden histories, uncovering stories that challenge what you think you know, and questioning the power structures that had shaped our world. Share this video with someone who needs to hear these truths. And comment below, how do you think we can create a more just and compassionate world? Your voice matters. Let's keep this conversation going. Thank you for watching. And remember, history is not just something we study, it's something we make. As the years passed, the story of Xerxes and the Persian court faded into history, lost among the rubble of empires, their names erased from time. Yet, the ripples of his reign, the brutality, and the psychological toll it inflicted on those around him, never truly disappeared. The women of the royal court, once seen as pawns in a game of power, continued to live in silence, their stories buried under layers of stone monuments and grand narratives of conquest. But for those few who had the courage to see beyond the walls of power, the story of Xerxes was not just a tale of a king's obsession, it was a reminder of the horrors that arise when one man is allowed to control everything, when power becomes the sole reason for existence. In the end, Xerxes died as he had lived, in fear, surrounded by walls of his own making. The palace, the empire, all crumbled beneath the weight of his decisions. And his legacy became one of broken families, betrayed allegiances, and a destroyed kingdom. His sons inherited not only the throne, but also the paranoia and isolation that had consumed him. They too had become prisoners of a system they couldn't escape, forced to live under the shadow of their father's reign, haunted by the lessons he had imparted to them in the silence of their palace chambers. But even in the darkest chapters of history, there's a glimmer of hope. The women who had suffered, the ones whose names were lost, whose voices were still, became symbols of resilience. And in their quiet strength, the legacy of resistance lived on. The palace of Xerxes, now reduced to ruins, stands as a ghostly reminder of a bygone empire. Its walls, once symbols of power and glory, now echo with the stories of those who lived and died within them, stories that weren't ever meant to be told, but that will never be forgotten. For the women who lived in the shadow of Xerxes' rule, their fight was never truly over. They passed down their stories to the next generation, teaching their children about strength, resistance, and survival. They may have been erased from the pages of history, but in the hearts of those who remember, their legacies endure. And so, while the empire crumbled, the truth remained. The story of Xerxes, the story of power and its inevitable collapse, the story of resistance and survival in the face of unimaginable oppression, became a lesson passed through the ages. In the end, it is not the kings and emperors who write history. It is those who survive, those who endure, and those who find a way to make their voices heard, no matter how many walls are built around them. The story of Xerxes is not just about one man, it is about all of us. It is a warning, a challenge, and a call to action. The walls of power may rise, but they will always fall. And when they do, it will be the voices of the oppressed, the silenced, and the forgotten that will rise above the ruins. So, remember this story, remember the women who survived, and remember that history is not just what we read, it is what we make. If you want to uncover more forgotten histories, more untold stories, subscribe to this channel. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. And comment below, what lessons do you think we can learn from the rise and fall of Xerxes and the empire he built? Let's keep the conversation going and ensure these stories are never forgotten.